In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, tucked away in a small, quiet town called Pine Ridge, there was a road that most locals avoided after Dark Hollow Road. The road, stretching through dense forests, was often blanketed by thick fog that seemed to come out of nowhere, and no one dared travel it after the sun dipped below the horizon. Many whispered of its cursed history, its haunting mysteries, and the restless spirits that lurked there. It was said that Hollow Road had been the site of many disappearances. Some claimed to have seen ghostly figures walking in the fog. Others swore they had heard strange laughter echoing through the trees late at night. But for those who had lived in Pine Ridge all their lives, it was a place to be feared and respected. And no one had ever dared to question the old legends until Ethan Carter came to town. Ethan Carter was a newcomer to Pine Ridge. He had moved to the small town just a few months ago, seeking solace from the fast-paced city life that had left him exhausted and broken. A truck driver by trade, Ethan spent most of his days on the road, delivering goods between nearby towns. He'd heard the rumors about Hollow Road, of course, but dismissed them as nothing more than ghost stories told to scare children. In the years he'd been driving, he had passed through plenty of remote and creepy areas, and none had affected him. Ghosts in his mind were nothing more than figments of imagination. It was a particularly cold night in early November when Ethan's journey would take him down Hollow Road for the first time. His cargo had been delivered late, and it was already past midnight by the time he started his return trip. The usual route he took would take him around the mountain pass, but tonight the roads had been closed due to an unexpected landslide. Left with no choice, Ethan took the detour through Hollow Road. As he drove deeper into the forest, the temperature seemed to drop by degrees. The mist, thick as smoke, rolled in suddenly, swirling around his headlights, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in front of him. The truck's engine hummed softly as the tires crunched against the wet road, but something felt different tonight. The silence felt unnatural. The wind howled through the trees, and the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. Ethan shivered and pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. He had driven down many rural roads in his time, but there was something about this one that gave him a sense of dread. He tried to brush it off as paranoia, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the shadows. The trees on either side of the road were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Just as he began to feel truly uncomfortable, he saw something in the distance. A figure, standing motionless at the side of the road. It was a woman, her form barely visible in the fog, but unmistakable. She was wearing a long white gown, the fabric swaying gently in the wind. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't tell whether she was in trouble or simply lost. But he wasn't the type of man to leave someone stranded in the middle of nowhere, no matter how strange the situation seemed. He slowed the truck and rolled down his window. "Need a ride?" he called out, his voice carried by the wind. The woman didn't respond at first, but as Ethan's truck came to a stop in front of her, she slowly turned her head. Her face was obscured by a hood, but as she lifted her head, Ethan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Her eyes were black, deep, endless pits of darkness that seemed to swallow everything around them. "I need to go to the old cemetery," the woman said softly, her voice as smooth as silk, yet carrying a strange echo. "Will you take me there?" Ethan hesitated. The cemetery was located on the outskirts of town, a good hour's drive away. It was also an area he had heard many strange stories about. Most importantly, it was the very place where some of the town's earliest legends began. Despite his better judgment and his growing sense of unease, Ethan nodded. "All right, hop in. It's not safe out here at this hour." The woman climbed into the passenger seat, and Ethan started driving again. The road stretched on, narrowing as they moved further into the woods. The thick fog now engulfed them completely, making the world outside appear as if it were a dark void. As they drove in silence, the woman never spoke. She simply sat there, her eyes staring straight ahead, unblinking. Ethan couldn't help but steal occasional glances at her. But every time he did, her gaze seemed to pierce through him, unnerving him even more. He turned his focus back to the road, hoping the silence would pass. But then the woman spoke again. This time her voice was colder, as if the very air around her had grown heavier. "Drive faster," she said. "I am running out of time." Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He pressed his foot to the gas pedal, and the truck roared forward, the tires screeching on the slick road. As he did, he could feel his heart racing, but he couldn't explain why. The more they traveled, the more it felt as though the road itself was becoming longer, stretching out into an eternity. Then a sudden realization hit him. He glanced at the woman again, and in that brief moment, her face had changed. Her skin was now as pale as bone, and her eyes were completely black. Her lips were thin, drawn into a faint smile that sent a wave of terror through him. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. Who are you?" Before he could react further, the woman began to laugh. It was a high-pitched, shrill sound filled with malice. The laughter seemed to echo around them, reverberating off the trees and the road. The truck jerked forward as though it had hit a pothole, and suddenly the engine died. Ethan slammed his hands on the steering wheel, trying to restart the engine, but it wouldn't budge. He looked around frantically, but the fog had thickened even further, making it impossible to see anything outside. "What's going on?" Ethan whispered, panic rising in his chest. The woman's laughter grew louder, and Ethan could feel his entire body going cold. He turned back to look at her, but she was gone, vanished. He checked the back seat and the empty road outside, but there was no trace of her. Shaken, Ethan started the truck again. The engine roared to life, but something was wrong. As he shifted the truck into reverse to turn around, the figure of the woman appeared again, right in front of the truck, standing in the middle of the road. Her eyes were now completely black, her skin ashen and stretched tight over her bones. Her lips, cracked and dry, parted to reveal a terrible smile. The woman slowly moved toward the truck, her movements deliberate and slow. Ethan tried to scream, but his voice was trapped in his throat. The woman approached the window, placing her cold hand against the glass. Her breath fogged up the window, and she whispered in a voice that sounded like 100 others layered together. "You can't escape me now, Ethan!" The truck's headlights flickered and dimmed as the woman pressed her face to the window, her hollow eyes staring into his soul. Ethan tried to turn the truck around again, but as he did, the engine sputtered and died once more. His hands shook violently as he fumbled with the keys, but nothing worked. A loud bang echoed through the truck, and Ethan's heart nearly stopped. He looked up and saw the woman, now standing at the front of the truck, her figure distorted and larger than life. She smiled again, and as she did, the mist around her seemed to swirl and gather in the shape of ghostly figures. The air grew colder. Ethan's breath came out in visible clouds, his hands frozen to the steering wheel. He looked at the woman, and in that moment, he realized what had happened. This was no ordinary person, and this was no ordinary road. He was caught in the grips of something far darker than he could ever have imagined. Then the woman spoke once more. "Now you are mine." The next morning, the truck was found abandoned on Hollow Road. Ethan was nowhere to be found. His family and friends spent days searching, but there was no trace of him. The police were puzzled, dismissing it as the case of someone wandering off into the woods. But the locals knew better. They knew the road was cursed, that the woman who roamed it was no ordinary ghost, but the spirit of someone wronged, someone who had died under mysterious and tragic circumstances. The history of Hollow Road went back over a century. In the early 1900s, a woman named Ranjana had lived in a small cabin along the road. She had been a young woman, betrothed to a man who had promised her everything. But on the night they were supposed to marry, her fiancé had betrayed her. He had abandoned her, leaving her stranded on Hollow Road in the dead of winter. Ranjana had died there, alone and broken, her heart filled with rage and despair. Her spirit, they said, had never left the road. For years, travelers had reported seeing her walking along the misty road, asking for a ride to the cemetery, her eyes black and filled with sorrow. And once she had her victim, she would claim them, trapping their souls in the mist, never to be seen again. The people of Pine Ridge had tried everything to rid the road of Ranjana's spirit. Prayers, rituals, even hiring paranormal investigators. But nothing worked. It was said that the woman had been waiting for justice, and until she received it, her curse would remain. Weeks passed, and the legend of Hollow Road grew. People spoke of a shadowy figure moving through the fog, of strange lights and laughter on the wind. Those who passed by the road after dark said they heard a truck, its engine sputtering and dying just as Ethan's had. Some swore they saw an old truck, abandoned and forgotten, with the faintest trace of a woman's silhouette inside. The curse had claimed another soul, and Ethan's disappearance was only the beginning. Days passed after Ethan's disappearance, and the town of Pine Ridge seemed to fall into an uneasy silence. People no longer spoke of Hollow Road without a nervous glance over their shoulder. The shadows of those who had gone missing seemed to linger in the streets, and the fog that occasionally rolled into town was no longer simply a weather pattern, it was a warning. But not everyone was scared. Sarah, Ethan's childhood friend, was determined to uncover the truth. She had known Ethan her whole life, and the idea that he had vanished into thin air didn't sit well with her. She refused to believe it was simply an accident or some wild misadventure. She had heard the legends of Hollow Road, but she always dismissed them as nothing more than ghost stories. After all, she knew Ethan well enough to know that he would never back down from something just because of a few tales. Sarah had spent the next few days reading everything she could find about the road. The local library, which housed records of the town's history, had a dusty old file on Hollow Road that no one seemed to have touched in decades. The file contained accounts of strange events stretching back to the early 1900s. Most of them involving missing people and unexplained disappearances. The reports were full of fear and confusion, and all pointed to the same eerie conclusion: the road was cursed. She couldn't ignore the connection between the curse and the woman who had appeared before Ethan that night. The file contained references to a woman named Ranjana, who had lived in a small cabin near Hollow Road many years ago. The locals had whispered that she had been the victim of an unspeakable betrayal, abandoned on the road by the very people who had promised to love her. Sarah found an old map in the file, pointing to a cemetery that had once been on the outskirts of town. The cemetery was now overgrown with weeds, its stones crumbling and forgotten. It was here, according to local legend, where Ranjana had died. She had been left alone to freeze in the cold, betrayed by her family, and her spirit had never left the road. Determined to find answers, Sarah packed a small bag and made her way to Hollow Road that night. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the fog-covered path. She had no idea what she was expecting, but the air felt thick, as if the road itself was alive, waiting for her. As Sarah drove down Hollow Road, the fog closed in around her. Her headlights illuminated little more than a few feet ahead, and every twist in the road seemed to stretch farther than it should. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of her car's engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, standing still, right in the middle of the road. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she slammed on the brakes. The figure didn't move, even as she came closer. It was a woman just as Ethan had described, standing motionless in the fog, dressed in a long, flowing white gown. "Not again," Sarah muttered under her breath. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, to drive away from this cursed place, but she couldn't. She had come this far, and she was determined to get to the truth. With shaking hands, she rolled down the window. "Can I help you?" she called, trying to steady her voice. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly turned her head, and Sarah felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. The woman's eyes were black, pure black, no whites, no pupils, just endless voids of darkness. "I need to go to the cemetery," the woman said. her voice like a distant whisper. "Take me there!" The words sent a wave of terror crashing over Sarah, but she couldn't bring herself to say no. Just like Ethan, she felt a strange pull, as though the woman's voice wasn't just a request, it was a command. "All right," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll take you." The woman climbed into the car without a word, and Sarah started driving again. As she moved forward, the fog seemed to close in tighter, and the road ahead seemed to twist in unnatural ways. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the world around her was changing, warping with every mile they drove. The woman in the passenger seat remained eerily silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, unblinking. Sarah kept glancing at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. But every time she looked at the woman, her face seemed to grow darker, more twisted. The air in the car grew colder, and Sarah's breath misted up the windshield. She reached out to turn on the heater, but her hand froze mid-motion as the woman spoke again. "Faster," the woman whispered, her voice now like ice. "We're running out of time." Without thinking, Sarah pressed the gas pedal harder, pushing the car faster through the fog. But no matter how fast she drove, the road seemed to stretch on, and the woman's face, her eyes, became even more distorted. Sarah's heart raced, and she could feel her grip on the steering wheel tightening. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out. The car coasted to a stop in the middle of the road, and Sarah tried in vain to restart the engine. Her breath came out in short, shallow gasps. The woman turned her head slowly, and a grotesque smile spread across her face. "You can't leave me now, Sarah," she whispered. Before Sarah could react, the woman was gone, as if she had vanished into the mist. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, but there was no sign of the woman. The silence was oppressive, and the air was thick with fear. Frantically, Sarah started the car again. This time the engine roared to life. She slammed the gear shift into reverse and turned the car around, desperate to leave. But just as she began to drive away, she saw the woman standing in front of her car, blocking the way. This time, the woman's face was fully exposed, her skin pale and stretched, her eyes wide and black as the void. Her lips parted in a horrifying grin. "You cannot escape me," the woman hissed. "You are mine now." Sarah's heart stopped as the woman slowly moved toward the car. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, trying to make the car move, but it was as if the world had frozen. The woman stepped closer, her breath fogging up the window. "You will never leave this road," the woman said, her voice a chilling echo. The next day, Sarah returned to town, shaken but determined to finish what she had started. She knew she had to do something to put an end to the curse. The legend spoke of a ritual, one that could free Ranjana's spirit from the road and bring peace to the restless souls trapped there. But Sarah didn't know where to begin. She sought the help of Father Thomas, a priest who had lived in Pine Ridge for many years. He had seen the strange occurrences around Hollow Road, and although he didn't speak much of it, he was the one person in town who seemed to understand the spiritual weight the road carried. Father Thomas listened patiently as Sarah explained what had happened the night before, her encounter with the ghostly woman, and her desire to end the curse once and for all. "I've heard the stories," Father Thomas said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "But to free Ranjana's soul, you will need more than just prayers. We must help her find peace. Only then will the road be rid of its curse." The priest prepared a ritual, a cleansing ceremony involving prayer, incense, and sacred chants that would invoke the power of both heaven and earth. But there was one catch. Sarah would need to confront Ranjana's spirit again, face to face. That night, Sarah and Father Thomas arrived at Hollow Road with a small group of villagers who had heard of the plan and wanted to help. They lit candles around an old stone circle at the side of the road, where the mist was thickest, and began chanting the ancient prayers. The wind picked up, swirling around them as they chanted, and suddenly there she was, the woman in white standing at the edge of the fog, her black eyes fixed on them. "You cannot undo what has been done," Ranjana's spirit hissed, her voice distorted and angry. Father Thomas stepped forward, holding the sacred relics and raising his hands to the sky. "You are trapped in your anger, Ranjana," he called out. "Let it go, find peace and release this curse." The woman's form flickered in and out, her anger turning to sorrow. She raised her arms and the fog seemed to thicken. The air crackled with energy, and for a moment Sarah thought she might not make it out of there alive. But then, with a final cry, Ranjana's form dissipated into the mist. The fog lifted, and a profound silence descended upon the road. The curse was finally broken. Months passed, and Hollow Road was no longer the place of nightmares it once was. The fog, though still present at times, no longer carried the same weight of dread. People began to drive down the road again without fear, and the once cursed path became just another stretch of asphalt through the trees. Ranjana's spirit at last had found peace. Her soul was no longer trapped by betrayal and anger, and the road was free from the weight of her sorrow. But sometimes, late at night, when the mist rolls in thick, travelers still hear the faint sound of a truck's engine sputtering, or the distant echo of a woman's voice calling for justice. And though Hollow Road may seem calm, the shadows of the past linger, as if they are waiting for the next soul to cross their path.